Welcome to the deep dive. We got some really, really interesting stuff from you guys this time.
Ah.
Seems like a lot of you are thinking about evangelism.
Yeah, tons of questions around that whole concept.
So we're gonna dive into this. We're gonna take a close look at this essay. It's called, very simply, Evangelism by Samuel Hugh Moffett.
Straightforward title.
Yeah.
So what we're going to do in this deep dive is really try to get a grip on what Moffett actually means when he uses this term evangelism. What is it according to him? What does he say it is? What does he say it isn't? And then why does he think it's so important in this bigger picture of Christian mission?
Right.
We want you to walk away really understanding what he's saying, maybe even have that aha moment where it's oh, that's what they've been talking about all this time. You know, that a familiar word, suddenly it just clicks into place in a new way.
Yeah, exactly. And it's important to know a bit about Moffett himself.
Yeah, where he's coming from.
His background to set the stage. This wasn't just some, theoretical thing for him. I mean, he actually spent years and years on the ground as a missionary in China and Korea.
Really experienced guy.
And then later on, he brought that experience into the classroom, too, as a professor, a very well-respected professor at Princeton Theological Seminary.
Wow.
So, he's not just talking out of a textbook here.
No.
These thoughts are rooted in real life.
Yeah, real world practice.
And in serious theological study.
Yeah.
And a key thread throughout this essay is his focus on how the New Testament itself understands evangelism.
Right from the source.
That's going to be kind of a guiding light for us as we go.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's dive in. What does evangelism actually mean? If we were to look at it through the lens of the New Testament, according to Moffett, how would we define it?
Well, one of the most fascinating things that Moffett points out right at the beginning is the New Testament seems to use this word evangelize in a really, really focused way. Surprisingly so. He points to this cluster of verbs that are used over and over again to describe it. Think about phrases like preaching the word, which we see right after Stephen's stoning in Acts chapter 8, verse 4, or heralding the kingdom, when Jesus sends out the 12 disciples in Luke 9.2. And then obviously proclaiming the good news, which shows up a bunch of times in Luke, like Luke 4.18 when Jesus is in the synagogue, and then again in Luke 8.1.
Right.
And it's interesting because these aren't just random descriptions, This is the consistent lange that's used to talk about this activity.
Okay, so if we strip away all the fancy phrasing,
Yeah.
what is it what's the core message that's being preached, heralded, proclaimed? What is that?
At its heart, Moffett argues that evangelism is simply the act of telling the good news, the gospel, that Jesus the Messiah is the saving king.
Right.
He defines evangelism as the announcement of Christ's kingdom. And here's, I think, a key insight. It's not just an announcement. It's not just reading a headline,
Mm-hmm.
It inherently includes an invitation.
Yeah.
It's a call to enter that kingdom through faith and with repentance, with turning away from what separates us from God.
Right.
It's a message that demands a response.
It's not passive.
Yeah, it's not just informational.
Yeah. All right, that makes sense.
Yeah.
It's not just delivering information. It's an invitation to something.
Life change.
Yeah. Okay, but then Moffett spends a good chunk of this essay explaining what evangelism is not.
Right.
Why do you think he feels it's so important to make those distinctions?
Well, because I think he's trying to protect what evangelism is. He wants to keep it distinct from other really important activities that Christians do.
Mm-hmm.
He's saying, look, evangelism is essential, but it's not everything. Jesus himself and his followers were clearly engaged in lots of activities beyond just announcing the kingdom,
Right.
So he's trying to define the boundaries a little bit. Yeah. He specifically mentions things like worship and the sacraments, right?
He does, yeah. He even quotes Paul.
Yeah, he quotes Paul in 1 Corinthians 1.17. Paul says, Christ did not send me to baptize, but to evangelize. Now, Moffett's not saying that baptism isn't important, because obviously it is.
It is, yeah.
But Paul's highlighting his specific calling here,
Right.
And similarly, Moffett argues that evangelism isn't the same thing as church growth or church planting.
Right.
Even though those might be natural results when people respond to the good news.
Yeah.
The act of evangelizing is the initial proclamation and invitation.
Yeah.
And he also talks about apologetics, doesn't he?
Yeah, he does. And that's, for someone trying to understand this, where does that fit in? Apologetics being the kind of the reasoned defense.
Yeah, defending the faith.
Faith, yeah.
Yeah, he acknowledges that Paul talks about persuasion, like in 2 Corinthians 5:11.
Right.
Paul says, we try to persuade. And obviously, apologetics, it does involve persuasion. Like, you're trying to use reason and logic to explain and defend the Christian faith.
Yeah.
However, Moffett also points to what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 1:7, 8, and 20, where Paul emphasizes that he was sent to share the good news, quote, not using the language of human wisdom, end quote.
Okay.
So while there's definitely a place for like thoughtful defense and explanation, Moffett sees evangelism as something more fundamental, you know? It's the clear and direct communication of the gospel message itself. Not primarily like a philosophical debate.
Right.
Or an intellectual exercise, you know?
Yeah, okay, but I think maybe the most striking distinction he makes.
Yeah, the one that stands out.
And maybe the one that gets people thinking the most is between evangelism and Christian service or social action.
Yeah, that's a big one.
That seemed like a really key point for him.
Yeah, and he brings up this this thing that he calls a revealing and disturbing incident in Acts chapter 6.
Okay.
So this is where the Greek-speaking Jewish Christians are feeling kind of overlooked in the daily distribution of food.
Right.
And the apostles' response to this situation might sound kind of surprising to some people today. They say, we cannot neglect the preaching of God's word to handle finances.
Right.
You know, and today I think a lot of people would say, well, wait a minute, like the church should be super involved in addressing social needs and injustices.
Yeah.
But Moffett uses this to show how the apostles understood their priorities. They knew they needed to address this injustice.
Right.
They did. They acted on it. They appointed deacons to oversee the distribution of food. But they didn't equate that act of service with evangelism itself.
Okay, so he's drawing a line there.
He is.
A distinction.
Yes.
But then he goes right into talking about this kingdom context.
Yeah.
So how does that add like nuance to this picture? Because it sounds like he's not saying evangelism should be completely separate from these practical acts of love and service.
That's such a good point, because he's not saying that at all. He argues that within the context of the kingdom of God that Jesus announced, evangelism was never meant to be this isolated message, you know? It's not delivered in a vacuum. He's saying that it should be connected to the real needs of the marginalized. The poor, the imprisoned, the blind, the oppressed.
Yeah.
And he even tells this really compelling story about a Korean pastor in Philadelphia who made it his priority to help new Korean immigrants.
Wow.
Find jobs, learn English, navigate a whole new country, you know, all these practical things before he ever formally shared the gospel with them.
That's powerful.
Yeah.
That's a great example of putting it into context, like you said.
Absolutely. But this is where Moffett offers a really important caution. And he says, and I'm going to quote him directly here, if there is anything worse than taking the text out of context, it is taking the context without the text. So what he's saying is that, yes, Christ's salvation is meant to impact every area of life. It's meant to meet people's needs, you know?
Right.
But it shouldn't be reduced to just meeting those needs.
Okay.
Jesus redefined concepts like shalom, like peace and wholeness, and the kingdom.
Yeah.
He's saying that salvation is more than just earthly well-being, and the kingdom is not just some political program or social program, you know?
Okay, so it's about holding both things together.
Yes.
Like the verbal proclamation and the practical demonstration.
Yes, without letting one overshadow or redefine the other.
Got it.
Yeah, Moffett really believes that either confusing evangelism with social action or separating them completely in practice, it's crippling to both. He describes this kind of problematic scenario where you might have some people who just offer a message about the king, but they have no concern for what his kingdom actually looks like in the world.
Right.
And then on the other hand, you might have people who are just focused on building a better world, but they've totally neglected this fundamental need for people to have a relationship with the king himself.
Yeah, and it feels like at different times in history, the church has kind of swung back and forth between those two extremes.
Yeah, that's what Moffett observes. He says there were times when Christians believed evangelism was the only thing that mattered, and he says they were wrong.
Right.
And then he points to this later shift where, you know, social justice became the main focus, which he also sees as potentially problematic, Like if that becomes the only focus, then the church might lose its unique voice in how it engages with the world.
So if neither of those extremes is ideal, then what does Moffett propose? He talks about this idea of like a partnership, but he also uses the phrase leading partner. So what does he mean by that?
He goes beyond just saying we need a balance. He argues for a dynamic partnership between what he calls faith and works, or, using other language, evangelism and social action.
Okay.
But his central argument is that in this partnership, evangelism should be the leading partner.
Okay.
And his reasoning is that what makes the Christian mission different from other efforts to make the world a better place, is the focus on our vertical relationship with God.
Right.
That's the foundation.
Okay.
And then our horizontal relationship with our neighbor, while absolutely vital, is like secondary in terms of foundational priority.
Okay, so leading in this case doesn't mean like more important in the grand scheme of things, but more like foundational in terms of what motivates everything else.
Yes, exactly. He's not saying that Christian action is less important,
Right.
He actually insists that, quote, without the accompanying deeds, the good news is scarcely credible. But he also says, and this is powerful, without the word, the news is not even comprehensible.
Wow.
And then he uses this analogy that I think is so helpful. He says, evangelism is one beggar telling another beggar where to find bread.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah.
It's simple, but it makes sense.
Yeah.
Like it's not about, being this perfect person or having it all figured out.
It's about sharing something that you found.
Yeah, exactly.
That's essential.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
And based on this whole understanding of evangelism, Moffett concludes that it's the supreme task of the church, both now and looking ahead to the future.
He does, and this conviction then directly shapes how he views mission strategy, especially when it comes to reaching people who haven't encountered the gospel yet.
Tell me more about that. Like, he really seems to emphasize directing our efforts towards those who've never even had the opportunity to hear, doesn't he?
He does. He believes that a core guiding principle for evangelism should be, and I'm quoting again, focus on those without the gospel. And he highlights this reality that more than half of the world's population still doesn't even have a basic understanding of the good news.
It's hard to fathom.
Yeah, it's crazy.
Wow.
For him, this is the most important and the most urgent challenge for evangelism today.
Yeah, and he raises some questions, too, about how the church is actually using its resources.
He does, yeah. He makes this really interesting point. He says, think about this. Somewhere between 70 and 80% of church mission funds are going to places that are already Christian, at least nominally Christian. He contrasts this with continents like Africa, where there are a lot of Christians, but the percentage is still lower.
Right.
And then especially Asia, where more than half the world's population lives, but only like 3 or 4% are Christian.
That's a huge imbalance.
It is. And he even mentions that non-Christian populations in Asia are growing at an incredible rate. Like, they're growing by more than the entire population of the United States every decade.
It's hard to even wrap your mind around that.
Yeah. So he's saying we can't treat every continent as if they have the same needs.
Right. Right.
We have to pay attention to who has and hasn't had access to the gospel.
Yeah.
He sees this imbalance as a selfish distortion of what our priority should be.
Okay, so it sounds like he's calling for a pretty big shift in how we think about and allocate resources.
Absolutely.
Now, he ends on a more personal and encouraging note, though, by emphasizing that anyone can get into the act of evangelism.
Yeah, and he tells this this great story about this watermelon vendor in Korea. So this vendor was just overjoyed about his faith, and when Moffett's wife, who was a foreigner, spoke to him in Korean, he was so excited. He didn't even care about selling her a watermelon.
Wow. He
just wanted to know if she was a Christian.
Wow. That's awesome.
And when she said yes, he was just over the moon.
Wow.
He wanted to hear all about her story.
That's a beautiful picture of just that simple, genuine desire to share the good news.
Yeah, and Moffett's point is that if more people had that kind of excitement about their faith, the future of evangelism wouldn't be something to worry about.
Yeah.
It brings it back to the individual, their experience and their willingness to share what they've found.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, so just to quickly summarize for everyone, based on what we've learned from Moffett's essay, evangelism, in its most basic New Testament meaning, is the clear announcement of an invitation to Christ's kingdom.
Yes.
It works together with other essential aspects of Christian life like worship and social action.
Yeah.
But it has this primary role, this leading role
Right.
in the Christian mission. And Moffett makes a really strong case for prioritizing our efforts towards reaching those vast numbers of people who haven't even heard the good news yet.
Absolutely. And I think for you, as someone who wants to get to the heart of complex topics, without all the fluff, understanding this framework can be really valuable. Like,
Right.
you're going to encounter these discussions about what faith-based organizations are doing or what individual Christians should be doing.
Right.
And this gives you a clear definition and
Yeah.
context.
Yeah, it's helpful.
Yeah.
So here's a final thought for you to consider. Given Moffat's emphasis on this huge, unequal distribution of the light of the knowledge of God around the world, how do we reconcile this need to address human suffering and injustice, which is so important
Right.
with what we believe is this equally important and urgent call to share what we think is the most transformative, the most life-giving truth?
Yeah.
It's a question that's it's worth wrestling with
It is.
and thinking about.
Yeah, for sure.
All right, thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Thanks for listening, everybody.
We'll see you next time.